So welcome everyone back to our final thinking space of the semester. Today we have two postgraduate presentations, but before we get started with those, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, of which we are meeting here today. I'd also like to extend that respect to the land of the people joining us on Zoom, wherever they may be across Australia. And I'd like to sort of extend those respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and as well as any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here who are here with us today. So I'll just advise that our presentation today is recorded, and Miike's presentation will be available on our YouTube channel at a later date if you'd like to rewatch that. Over now to introduce our second speaker, Mieke Bourne, who will be presenting on Zoom. So Mieke is a current PhD student at the School of Geosciences. She also leads engagement with restoration evidence and large-scale restoration programs at the Centre of International Forestry Research, World Agroforestry, and brings to this project over 16 years of experience working on sustainable land management and facilitation across multiple countries such as Africa, Asia, and Australia as well. So take it away, Mieke.
Thank you so much. And just checking that you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Mieke Bourne, and as mentioned just now by Emma, I am a PhD candidate within the school, supervised by Bob Fisher and Phil McManus, and looking into the question of stakeholder engagement with evidence and how this process can shift decision culture. So just before I start, I know there's been some acknowledgement of country, but I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm calling from. So I'm joining from the south coast of Western Australia. This is Noongar country of the Bibbulmun and Menang people. And I pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and for the care that they have continuously given this land. But I would also like to acknowledge the people, the many peoples, the hundreds of groups of peoples that live in the countries that I've been working in across sub-Saharan Africa and where this research will take place, and particularly within Kenya, the Kamba and the Luo people. Emma just outlined a few things about me, but just to give a little bit of background, I've been living for the past 13 years in Kenya, particularly in Nairobi, and working then and continue to work at World Agroforestry. This is now called C4ECRAF. It's a very long acronym, but in essence, this is the International Centres of Research in Forestry and Agroforestry. And I've just recently moved back to Australia, where I started my career many years ago working on land care. I have a strong connection to Kenya. My husband and my children are Kenyan, and have therefore spent a lot of time there, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa across multiple countries, and have begun to understand a lot of the diversity and the way that land is managed there. I've also been quite involved in the topic that I'm looking at, which is stakeholder engagement with evidence. I've been co-developing approaches and taking this in my work as well as research. And you can see there's a few publications that I've recently been involved in on stakeholder engagement around evidence. So this is really to say that this research and this PhD journey is building on existing projects, existing work and engagements, and really trying to look a little bit deeper into the questions that have emerged and some of the gaps to be able to build out some of the theory and the understanding of these areas. So the research question that the overarching research question that I'm looking at is around stakeholder engagement and how this can enhance transformational learning. Transformational learning around science, but also actor experience. So this is local Indigenous knowledge, practitioner knowledge. How do these come together in these transformational spaces to improve the decisions that are made, as well as the outcomes of these decisions within the setting of sustainable land management, which we understand is very complex and varies across different places. I have a number of sub-questions. I'm very interested in how facilitation of these engagements can enhance the consideration of this knowledge coming from multiple sources and how this informs the decision-making. Also, the consideration of knowledge from all of these sources, how this can improve the decisions that are made and the outcomes, as well as the components of the engagement process. What leads to greater shifts in the attitudes and the behavior of development practitioners, but also of scientists. And one part of the research will focus particularly on the skills and processes that are needed to inform how multiple sources of information come together for adaptation pathways at community level. A little bit about the area that my research and work is taking place within. I've been working in sub-Saharan Africa. The top map shows 8 countries, 4 in East and 4 in West Africa, that are particularly the focus of one part of the study. And the second part of the study focuses much more intently on Kenya. You can see the map just below. So Kenya has 47 sort of sub-national levels. So these are equivalent to states. The population of Kenya is just over double that of Australia. So think of these as small states, each of them. And I'm working particularly in Makueni County and in Homa Bay. And that Homa Bay is on the edge of Lake Victoria. So within all of these countries, within sub-Saharan Africa, there has been some sort of colonial history. And this has had an immense impact on society, but also on the current administrative structures, the way that bureaucracies come together and the way that meetings take place. And so this has an impact on engagement. In all of these countries, subsistent agriculture, whether it's cropping or pastoralism, is the main source of livelihood for the majority of people, and agriculture contributes significantly to the GDP. Most of this agriculture is rain-fed, leaving it highly vulnerable to climatic shifts. And of the productive land, over 65% is degraded, also leading to challenges in resilience and in livelihoods and productivity. Through this process of degradation, largely motivated or shifted by changing agricultural practices and an intensification of this cropping patterns, there's been a large push for landscape restoration, and this comes in many forms around soil and water conservation, around soil fertility, around agroforestry and other practices. Within the continent, there's been a push for forest and landscape restoration for 100 million hectares target to be restored. And at the global level, we're in the midst of a UN decade on ecosystem restoration, which is also promoting more investment and focus on restoration. But within this restoration space, there are a number of decisions that are being made that are not necessarily producing ideal outcomes for the communities. And this is why this focus on decision-making and bringing knowledge from multiple sources coming together has been so critical. I want to spend a few minutes on the 2 projects. I mentioned that this work is building on existing projects and existing research and development efforts. And so I want to highlight those 2 projects that my research will build upon. The first one is Regreening Africa. I showed before the 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a recently completed project. Its intention was to see if we could promote community-led, large-scale restoration across a large area of land. And so we reached out to over 600,000 households. There was a high adoption rate in many of those households, and over 350,000 hectares, showing some form of restoration within that time. The focus of Regreening Africa was on integrating trees into croplands, communal lands, and where appropriate, pastoral areas, complemented with sustainable land management practices, and looking at value chains, livelihoods, and policy interventions for an enabling environment. It used resources from the European Union and implemented by a number of different actors, led by C4ICRAF, which is where I work, and I was leading this program for the final years. And it recently had recognition as a UN Decade Restoration Flagship at the global level. So one of these large-scale recognized restoration efforts. Within this research, what I will be focusing on is the internal, within the project, iterative learning adaptation process. We had annual reflection and learning processes with input from the community in the field, from scientists, from practitioners, and we brought that together through a structured process to be able to reflect and learn and adapt the program year by year. And we also had several other engagement processes to try and collectively look at what was changing, what was happening, and to adapt the program. And so while there was some positive indication from this process that hasn't been studied, and there's no indication of what really was effective in bringing about changes and what could be improved for the future. The second project, also with the name Regreening, but with a slightly different focus, is building on an approach that was developed by World Vision Australia with communities across these countries, and looking at a framework to support community-led regreening, with a particular focus on something called farmer-managed natural regeneration. Farmer-managed natural regeneration is where communities are supporting natural resprouting of trees and shrubs instead of planting trees, and often leading to higher biodiversity, indigenous species regeneration, and having quite a lot of success across a number of countries. The Regreening Communities approach has been applied in many, many countries, but within Kenya, where I'm focusing, there are a number of sites where this particular approach is being undertaken. And ACIR are considering funding a research project to look at this Regreening Communities approach, but to take in consideration future climates. So asking the question of how the co-creation of equitable climate adaptation pathways could strengthen community regreening processes and enhance the capacity to adapt to climate change over time. This funding is not necessarily secured yet, but once this program begins, my particular focus in the research, in the broader research question, will be on the stakeholder engagement with evidence. There are many different literature strands that come around this question, particularly looking at stakeholder engagement and participation, all the way from the initial sort of ladder of participation through the newer reflections on it, looking at the approaches to interaction and engagement at local levels, looking at social capital and social interactions. There's also a large amount of literature on iterative learning and adaptation, and particularly focusing on adaptive collaborative management, which is an approach that was used strongly within C4 and looks at a very much a community-led co-learning, co-reflection, adaptation and improvement process. And I'll come back to that with the links to participatory action research. And then the third strand is on decision science, how we make decisions, how we co-produce information, how we learn as adults, and also some behavioral science. And as was mentioned in the presentation before, there's a lot written on what could take place and how engagement and participation should be undertaken. There's a lot less on how it actually takes place in action to bring around a desired change and positive outcomes. So in this research, I really will be focusing on where the engagement approaches interact with evidence. And this is evidence from multiple sources, this knowledge from science, from local knowledge, from practitioner and community experience. So the intersection between good stakeholder engagement and evidence for good quality decision-making that leads to better outcomes. So the study approach has these two phases building around these two different projects, both looking at engagement with evidence, but one more at the project level, this first phase, and one more at the community level, which is the second phase. So this first phase is reviewing Regreening Africa, which I just outlined, and at the adaptive and iterative learning process within the project. To undertake this, I'll be analysing secondary sources of information, These are publicly available reports and some project documents from the project team that will be de-identified, to be able to construct the engagement process, what took place when, and to show the shifts in decision-making and well as in the language and the attitudes of the participants. And then I will undertake some semi-structured interviews with the development partners and the scientists that were involved in this project to understand their views on the process, as well as what they felt led to changes in attitudes and behavior, and using thematic analysis for these results. The second phase of the study is looking at this regreening communities at the local level, at the community level, as well as at the subnational level, where the local government has some influence on the community decision-making, and particularly on this future climates and adaptation pathways. And this is centered around the options that community members are deciding on that they want to implement within their land that they're managing to be able to adapt to deal with land degradation, but also taking into account the future climatic situation. Within this particular phase, I'll be studying facilitation, how we bring people together and how we work through processes together, as well as visualization. So visualization of data, of knowledge, of lived experience, and how we bring those together to inform the decision-making and the information that can be used to select the options that the community would like to implement. So the way that the facilitation will be designed and the visualization will depend on feedback from the community on what they believe could be beneficial and what has worked well in terms of the language, in terms of the delivery. And we'll be trialing these different approaches to see what leads to good outcomes for a diverse set of community members. Within these workshop settings, we'll be using event ethnography. So understanding, looking at the structure of the room, how people are engaging, how people are interacting, who's talking and who's not, the level of interest, as well as semi-structured interviews post-workshop. And again, thematic analysis for patterns of meaning. Just to highlight that we'll be using a participatory action research approach, particularly in that second phase, because the first phase for Greening Africa at the project level, there was a process of iterative learning and reflection, but we'll be reflecting back on the project that's finished. Whereas in the second phase of the research, this will be working actively with the communities, co-developing options, testing those options out within workshop settings, and then reflecting with the community on how effective those approaches were, trialing new approaches, and then eventually implementing practices that the community feel make sense for their setting, and then to see the impact of those. So we'll be having a reflection process within a broader programmatic reflection process. And this participatory action research is really intended to solve those problems that are taking place in the field while also generating the research outcomes. The last phase of the research will be drawing on the insights from phases 1 and 2, as well as on previous research that I've undertaken and others and published literature. For example, this picture on the screen is from some previous work at policy level and interacting with facilitation and visualization options for policymakers. The intent is to look at a set of principles and a framework for how to support evidence-based decision-making in an inclusive way through engagement processes. My timeline is that the ethics application is in, and we've received some initial feedback and now waiting for final approval and response. Once that is received, I'll move into the interviews, the semi-structured interviews for phase 1, and then phase 2 when that part of the funding is secured and we move to the field with literature review and writing running throughout that process. And I'll come back to the references in just a moment, but just to thank you for the opportunity to present my thinking on what this research will involve, and leaving you with a picture of 2 people discussing the decisions that they will make on their field of groundnuts, which is peanuts in Senegal, under a baobab tree, around what density of trees they want to bring back on their land and what will make sense. So I'll just go back to the references for a second and stop there. I think we have maybe a couple of minutes if there's any questions or comments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your research so far with us, Mieke. So any questions from the audience?
If no one else will jump in, I will obviously take the opportunity. I'm wondering, so, I mean, this is a question that most people in the room, I think, will be thinking about, but on the one hand, so many really cool opportunities will come from this because you have this long engagement with these projects. And on the other hand, you don't really want to produce a piece of evaluation science, and you also need to be a kind of independent researcher kind of engaging with this. And so I'm just wondering how you think about your role as researcher, as I think Tanya Lee writes about it as being like practitioner and critic, or programmer and critic, I think she calls it, and how you be both of those things at the same time.
I think that's a really important question, and it is something that I've thought about a lot, because within all of these engagement processes, I'm involved in designing them and thinking through them, and that does make me very close to the question and to the topic. But I also think within these sort of larger programs, we do really need to improve the way that we work collectively, and so to bring a critical lens to understand what is actually working and what is not, and in what kind of situations, will add so much value to future programs, that there's a strong motivation, I think, to be a critic as well as the practitioner, and an opportunity also, because for Greening Africa, there's a second phase coming, there's an opportunity to bring those lessons. And so the more critical we are, the more informed and better outcomes there can be for the future. But I'm also putting in place a few practical ways that I can make sure that I have other insights. So for the event ethnography, there'll be others that are capturing the reflections and the feedback. I'll also use, for the thematic analysis, I'll use some natural language processing as well as my own manual review, so that I have ways to validate and to cross-reference as I go through, to make sure that that critique angle is also very strong in the work. So they're the main sort of approaches that I'm taking to that, but I think it's a really important question that needs to sort of stay in my mind as I go through the process.
Sorry, I just want to add, like, I think there's a conceit of, like, you know, that there is no kind of bias, there is an unbiased opinion. And I think that is not true. I think there's an interesting thing to play on here in terms of like what co-designed research looks like, or what participant action looks like, which is always going to require this very intimate knowledge of what is going on. So I'm not trying to suggest that you have to kind of step out of that somewhat, but I think there's an interesting way that you can kind of be embedded within that while also allowing yourself space for critical reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway,
yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Great. Is there any more questions for Mieke?
It sounds like such fabulous research. It sounds really good.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is a nice place to leave it. So this is our last Thinking Space seminar of the semester. So we'll be sending out some program dates in due course once they're all finalised. But in the meantime, if you are interested in presenting in the next semester's Thinking Space, please let me or Bob know, or if you know someone who might be interested in presenting as well. We'll be putting out the official call for presentations soon. So great. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to